Sometimes in a peak experience, we feel like I could never forget this, right? It will stay with me, and it's not necessarily the case. So sometimes it does, and it's amazing, and we find a way to naturally integrate it. And other times we come back into life and we get pulled back into the same dynamics, and
Yeah,
without
yeah.
realizing, because we don't have the capacity to, we fall right back into that same river, and the insights can fade over time, the memory can fade over time.
Welcome to the Seeing in the Dark podcast, the podcast for the women of the ancient futures. Women that see beyond eyes and know beyond mind and are here to make a change from a deep communion with the mystery of life. Seeing in the Dark is about walking paths that have not been walked before and daring to show up for the mission and dream life that is knocking on your door. My name is Nicole Nyima Costerus, mystic, medium, initiated priestess, and here to take you into the mysteries of purpose, power, ritual, and intuition. May you embody your own unique essence so deeply that your vibration naturally teaches, inspires, and assists others. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of the Seeing in the Dark podcast. I'm sitting here together with Victoria Etherington, and I'm really excited about this topic that we're going to speak on. It's the topic of integrating peak experiences. And when we had a little chat before we agreed to do a podcast episode, when she shared about the work she's doing, I was like, wow, this is such an important work to see. What is integration? How do we integrate well? Like, what are some of the challenges we come across? And that's all we're going to dive into together in this conversation together. So welcome, Victoria. I'm super happy that you are here.
Thank you. Me too. I'm excited to speak to you. And yeah, I think I already mentioned the first time I came across you and the work that you do, I was just so excited about all these different modalities that you're exploring. And I just saw right away the connection between our two ways of approaching, I think, the same bubble, the same sphere in a way. So yeah, very excited.
Yeah, because you are a life coach and an integration guide. Can you share a little bit more about what that means, integration guide?
Yeah, so I take my coaching practice, and I've specialized actually in the integration of peak experiences. And a peak experience, I think very commonly we've heard of, integration for psychedelic experiences, which can be one type of peak experience that's induced through substance. But actually, it doesn't have to be. So, for example, a Vipassana retreat is a peak experience, a darkness retreat, a pilgrimage can be another peak experience. So it's any kind of experience that can feel like it sits outside of our day-to-day life and can sometimes be a challenge, therefore, to integrate it and to bring it back and to really work with it in our everyday reality. So what I do is I
Yeah.
work with people in either preparing, so ideally we work already together beforehand for that experience in order to figure out what is it that actually they would like to gain out of it, and also then integrating the experience afterwards, meaning understanding what happened and really beginning to figure out how they want that experience to influence or connect to the rest of their life.
Very beautiful. And you're naming here dark retreats, but I imagine any type of retreat is a peak experience, right? I can see this so often in my work also when women come into a retreat. They're in this safe bubble almost, and they go through these big openings and transformations. And then the moment they bring it back to their daily life, I see sometimes also this experience of bumping into a wall. Like, how am I going to now integrate all these openings into my daily life? How do I do that? So I feel curious. Can you share a bit more about what integration is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you touched on a few really beautiful points there. So maybe one thing I would love to add is also festivals can be these peak experiences like burns. And I had a recent experience where, on the final day, people already had the sense of crying. So they were realizing that there's something huge that had happened, or an opening that they now need to bring back. So the process of integration really is, how do we take what we experienced in that time that feels so special and sometimes so out of this world or out of the ordinary, and bring it home how do we begin to make sense of it? So I would say the first part really is taking the time to clarify for ourselves what is it we experience. So making a note or trying to really understand it. So it can be that things aren't so clear yet in our minds and capturing the experience itself before we start to then also think about how we want to connect that experience to the rest of our life. So I sometimes think of this analogy of you have a new puzzle piece and you have the puzzle that was your life before, and now you need to kind of puzzle it in and see, okay, how will it connect to this relationship, or how will it impact my way of viewing my role within nature or within my community? So figuring out what are the connections we want to make once we know what this puzzle piece even is. And then the final step is taking the actions. So also taking that insight and turning it into real transformation into our external world or the world around us, so that it's not just an experience and not just this anecdote and this story of this one time I went there and I saw this and it's in the past. Because when it's really integrated, it's continuing to really take shape in the world around it.
Yeah, beautiful. I just noticed as I'm listening to you, I would actually love to rewind a bit before the integration. Can you share a bit with us about what are peak experiences like? Because we named some things like dark retreats, psychedelic experiences, festivals, any big experience. But can you share some of the signs or the elements that a peak experience has? Like one of the things I already named was like the big openings that we suddenly have. Huh? And you named some things around seeing certain things during the psychedelic journey, for example. But can you share a bit about what defines a peak experience?
So I think for me, a peak experience feels like it sits out of our ordinary day-to-day experience. So it can be then not very clear sometimes how exactly it fits to the rest of reality. And I think you made a really beautiful point of, sometimes you come out of this experience, you come home, and it's almost like you hit a wall. So it can also be, and often is, an experience that contains a lot of input. So either, like in the example of a retreat, perhaps a lot of different experiences you've had within a short amount of time that are new, that are potentially challenging in some ways, or maybe that you're exploring boundaries or you're exploring new ways of being, kind of stretching yourself in that sense. And sometimes, and I think this is where peak maybe kind of speaks to that, it can also be a very overwhelming experience, not necessarily always positive in the moment or during the experience itself. So it can be, difficult to even comprehend. And this is definitely true of psychedelic experiences. And I think darkness retreats also can create that kind of space. So there is this element of, wow, this is almost too big, or there's a lot happening here. And I think you mentioned the openings, also the sensitivity that we come out of those experiences with is one factor. And sometimes also the sense that we don't really know how or what exactly it is that we've experienced or how to make sense of it. So it can also be a confusing experience. And I sometimes think of this, if you go down into the mine and you're looking for something and you find these black coals and you don't know it's a diamond until you start kind of working on it and kind of really exploring it a bit more. So it can also be just confusing sometimes, that the things we come out of these experiences when trying to figure out, like, what even is this? Is it a value? Is it just a I picked up on the way that has no purpose? And so there is a confusion as well that can come out of it.
Yeah. And even as you were sharing, when you shared about the peak experience, I literally saw your body posture going up like this. And I think this is also one of the signs that peak experiences have, that it can also be a bit ungrounded somehow. And what I hear you, or what I feel when I listen to how you support people with integration, it's very much also about breathing out again and landing it, rooting it down, which I believe is so important. I remember this time, for example, in my studies, like you said, I studied many different modalities, many different teachings. And there was this moment where I was just doing one training after another, which I believed also served me in a way, because it cracked me open. It was like, like tick, 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 and then boom, I cracked open. But I don't know if I integrated those specific years really well. So I think it's this landing piece and this breathing out, especially in this time where new age spiritual development is like really popular, going from peak experience to peak experience. I think this is such an important element that is often missing.
Yeah, this translation, right, of that experience into something that stays with you and begins to influence your day to day. And as you were speaking, I had to think there's a point in many spiritual traditions where if you start, let's say in Zen Buddhism, if you are often meditating and finding yourself going into different realms and different kind of worlds and spaces, and you share this with your teacher, if they feel that it's happening too often and you're disconnecting, so you're not rooting anymore, they may tell you to stop meditating. And we know this also in the psychedelic space. So jumping from experience to experience with psychedelics can also create this instability in the mind, and people can start to disconnect, sensing that this is not a reality that they can connect to anymore. And
Yeah.
the recommendation is often then to take a pause, to really find a way to root, to ground. And this is, I think, the beautiful actual spiritual practice of finding the balance between these two things that sometimes seem irreconcilable, but actually coexist. And so accepting in a way the contradiction and this, duality and non-duality that
Yeah.
are there
So you
together.
mean the balance between opening multidimensional while staying grounded in this human form and reality?
Exactly.
Yeah, beautiful. So you're actually already naming some challenges around integration. Huh? I heard you say about the disconnection, which actually, like, I'm in this process of Kundalini awakening, and sometimes when it goes too open, my teacher also will tell me, stop your practices, stop what you're doing, like just focus on grounding. So I very much relate with what you said about teachers actually recommending to stop your practices for a while. But what are some of the challenges that you see happening around integration?
I think especially in kind of the modern life that we have structured around us, or at least the life that is around me here in Berlin, that I see one of the challenges I see people face most often is time, really giving space and time to that integration. So a retreat is often, kind of squeezed in between other things, and you have this temptation or desire almost to jump into work or to come back into daily life and right away hit the ground running, and not having that space, not having really the time to sit with yourself, to be in stillness for some time, to feel those openings that are still there and what's still active within you, and to then also take really tangible steps towards how you want to work with it. It requires intention and commitment. So this is one challenge that I see. And of course, when we jump right back into life, another thing that can happen is this sense that sometimes in a peak experience, we feel like I could never forget this, right? This is so big and so important and so life-changing. It will stay with me. And it's not necessarily the case. So sometimes it does, and it's amazing, and we find a way to naturally integrate it. And other times we come back into life and we get pulled back into the same dynamics, maybe the same relationships, etc., that we were hoping to influence or to change, and
Yeah,
without
yeah.
realizing, because we don't have the capacity to, we fall right back into that same river, and the insights can fade over time, the memory can fade over time. And so I always, when working with people, recommend the first moments coming out of a peak experience after having time to rest, to really as much as possible capture what they experienced without necessarily analyzing it or understanding it yet, but really just writing down. Or I personally like to speak into a microphone. I find it easier than writing. Just somehow archiving everything that you still remember while it's fresh in your memory. And this serves one purpose, which is to create the neural connections so that you can also strengthen those and come back to it more easily. But also you have the very physical, tangible piece of paper or recording that you can come back to later on to see what is still there that maybe, slipped your mind or you weren't able to remember. So this is one quite big challenge I see. Another is a little bit coming back to the sense of, sometimes we come out with a lot of information and a lot of input, and we're not really clear on how we want to work with it or what even is there. So spending some time to really look at what are the different pieces of rubble or kind of coal that we've come out of the cave with, just to see like which ones are really valuable. It takes some effort as well. And it can be confusing. It's not always clear. So again, it requires us to really sit down and have that commitment to keep going and to really explore it. So those are, I think, two of the biggest factors in terms of challenge. And one that I would love to add is more around when the experience itself has been challenging. It can be quite intimidating to come back to it. So it may be that something comes up that in the moment felt difficult. We weren't fully ready or didn't feel fully ready to experience it. And then coming back to it during the integration process can feel quite daunting. So yeah, there is an element of support maybe that's needed in those cases, or finding the right way to be able to work with the emotions that came up, that feel safe, that feels possible. And actually, because it's out of the peak experience, because you're in a different state of mind, it actually is a beautiful opportunity to do it then, especially as you've had time to come back into your natural state.
Yeah, I noticed that I feel a curiosity around, do you believe that we only experience what we are ready for? Or is your experience as an integration guide that sometimes we actually do experience things we're not ready for? I feel curious, what's your perspective on that?
Personally believe that everything we experience is a reflection of something that's within us. So in that sense, it's already there. I think we are able to experience it because on some level, it is a part of us that is always influencing us and kind of pulling different strings in our relationships or in dynamics that we're involved in, whether we're facing it or not. That being said, I also know that especially in a state of overwhelm, or perhaps if the setting and the space that you're in doesn't feel right, if that part of you surfaces and you're not in a supportive environment where you feel able to face it, it can be a real challenge. And in that sense, I think this is where the sense of, okay, I'm not ready can sometimes come up. I'm not ready. This is not the right moment. I don't know what to do with this. I'm already being triggered by this other person or whatever it is that's here. I'm not in a right state. And then it can become a point of resistance. But in the sense, yeah, it's a part of us. So how can we not be ready to see it?
Yeah, beautiful. So are there any, because you're sharing about some of the challenges, and I actually recognize the first one because I gave birth 4 months ago, which is a massive peak experience. And I actually did write down some things, even I was too busy to do it like in depth, but I did write down some sentences and some notes because actually now looking back, I did lose a lot of the detailed information of what happened during that day. But I wonder, are there some specific practices or things the listener can do if they're like, oh yeah, wow, I actually want to spend more time integrating my peak experience, but how do I do that? You named recording or writing things down as one of them, which I think is super valuable.
Yeah.
But are there more?
Yeah, absolutely. There's many, many tools that can be used in this process, and it's a very personal experience. So, for people listening, feel free to pick and choose based on also what resonates with this. I already mentioned, I personally prefer speaking over writing. One very beautiful practice that gets us out of the analyzing kind of thinking mind is diving into, for example, mandalas. So creating mandalas or drawings or other visual representations of the experience, so that we are working with slightly different parts of our mind, of our brain, in order to still engage in the same process, right, of understanding and clarifying, but from a more creative perspective.
So like making art out of it?
Exactly. So perhaps representing, if let's say your experience felt like a journey and it has clear chapters, it can really be like drawn as a journey and as things unfold. And it doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be good for anybody else. It's just for you to represent it. So colors can also be really important in that sense. Maybe very specific colors or shapes or figures were coming up that might not be clear right away, but capturing those while they're still fresh. It's also, yeah, one way to work with it more on the visual side. One practice that I personally love comes from family constellations. So this idea, right, that we can represent in the physical space around us systems and different pieces or parts that have a relationship. And I feel that that's also often true of peak experiences. So different things have appeared and they have some relationship to one another that we can explore. And so I create a little physical altar or constellation, placing items that represent pieces or parts of the experience in relation to each other. And then I'll leave it for some time. And I'll go back to it over, let's say, a week or 2 weeks, and really begin to explore just with curiosity, like, oh, what does it tell me that I picked this shape, or that this, a rough texture compared to the softness of the texture of this other item? Just really continuing to explore in this much more creative way. Sometimes really beautiful insights can come because we're, again, bypassing this very linear analytical mind and looking at it from a different perspective. And it also creates anchors. So then if I now have and I have something here I can maybe show. I have this beautiful figure that for me represented a chapter with my father. And it's just something I have in my home. And now that it's been a part of that constellation, it's also part of my home. Every time I see it, I'm reminded of the insight that came from that specific journey.
Beautiful.
So these anchors, these little ways of really reminding yourself on a regular basis of those insights, again, serve to strengthen the neural connections so that you create bridges that are much easier to cross. So on a very literal way, more easily find your way back to that thought, back to that moment, and therefore much more likely in the moment that you'll be able to act on the insight that came.
Beautiful, which is very much similar to the power of ritual, I feel. As I hear you share in one of the programs that I'm teaching, Rites of Passage, it's very much about ritualizing these moments of change and transformation. For example, I have tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, I have my closing ceremony after my birth, right? So it's like a tangible ritual that marks that transition into motherhood. And like now when I see you showing the statue that symbolizes a chapter with your father, it's making the transformation very tangible and therefore also more embodied and more landed in the physical experience. Yeah, beautiful.
And I love this idea actually of also creating a ceremony to, in a sense, close it, because there may be a moment where integration also can feel complete. And it can be a moment of really saying, okay, I think I'm done with the exploring part. I'm now ready to move into action or whatever that next step might be.
So what is your perspective on the time of integration? Is there a time for integration, or does everybody have their own unique timing? What I mean is the length of the integration process.
Yeah, very unique, I would say. And depending on the person and, the experience, the peak experience itself. Some integration specialists say it's really a lifelong practice. And in a sense, it is, because depending on the insight, it might be something that, you need to keep reminding yourself over and over and put into action. So in that sense, the gifts of integration can continue for quite a long time. But for me, integration, often there's a moment where it feels like if we've completed, let's say, the exploration of that specific peak experience. So maybe, of course, that, the chapter is not fully closed and certain things keep coming up later, and that's totally fine. But overall, there's a sense of, okay, I think I have now gotten the most out of that experience that I can right now. I feel comfortable, saying that this is complete in that sense. And then you can continue still working with those insights. So it doesn't mean that that's done and that's kind of forgotten, but perhaps the exploration phase and the discovery phase of the meaning of the experience feels more complete.
So it's a very intuitive process to know when the integration has completed.
And of course, it really depends on the type of experience. So integrating something like grief or the death of somebody we love, that can really come, or what I'm learning from personal experiences, it feels like the pendulum swings differently over time, but there are moments where still residual feelings appear and there's moments of sadness. And in a way, I feel like I'll be integrating certain losses for the rest of my life. But there was a more intense, more vivid period where I felt like I needed to put my attention there. Now I feel like I'm at a point where the emotions or the insights that still come from that loss will just flow more easily, and I can allow them to come and go and without resistance.
So you would say, because we've been talking about retreats, we've been talking about psychedelic experiences, we've been talking about festivals, like different peak experiences, but would you say that the loss of a loved one or a dear one, would we call that a peak experience, or is that like a valley experience?
Yeah, I guess a valley experience is a beautiful word. It's a peak experience or a valley experience in the sense that it's something that's quite big and momentous, and it creates a potentially quite a big disruption in our day-to-day life, especially if it's somebody close, maybe somebody really integrated in our family system or in our just social environment as well. And of course it requires, in a way, that again, that repuzzling of the puzzle. It's like, what does it mean then if this piece comes out? How do I want to now accept this or work with this in relation to other aspects of my life? So what does it mean, for instance, when I lost my father, what does this now mean for my relationship to my mother, to my sister? How do we begin to relate to each other whilst acknowledging this loss? And kind of the mourning process really felt very much like an integration process for me personally.
So we shared a little bit about some things that people can do in the integration process after the peak experience or valley experience. Okay, before we actually go to before, I actually do feel curious. Is there a difference between integrating the loss of a loved one, for example, or integrating a psychedelic retreat or a dark retreat or transformational retreat?
I would say the steps can be quite similar. So I think the actual tools we might use, so the how, may look different, right? So for example, you may not want to draw a mandala to process the kind of grieving of a loss or the loss of somebody you love. But you might choose another practice or maybe a ritual or another ceremony or other way of, in a very intentional and very considered way, spending time on really understanding what this change or shift will mean for you, what you want it to mean for you as well. Because I think one thing maybe I didn't touch on yet that I would love to stress is I really believe that we have choice over the meaning we ascribe to these peak experiences.
I love that you mentioned that.
And in that same way, I think, how I chose to process my father's death, and I think how, for example, my mother has chosen to process it, has been different. And we've made different choices in what that will mean for us, what that means for our lives, for how we want to understand our reality as well. So for her, it had really profound, very spiritual, I would say, consequences. And for me, it was a very healing in the kind of family systems way. So I really tried to focus on creating empathy and love and celebrating what we were able to have as a family while we were alive, where she focused much more on what happens after the soul has gone. Where does it go? What does this mean for my death? So we gave very different meanings to the death of someone that was close to both of us. So this is, I really believe, a choice, and a very beautiful choice that we have. So by sitting down, by really giving it time and trying to understand it, we can also, in a way, write the story of our lives after that peak experience.
So can you share, you mentioned that there are certain steps that are the same. If it's like even if it's a loss of a loved one or going to a retreat, what are those steps that we go through in the process of integration?
So I think the first step for me after a peak experience very often is to take just rest. So time to recover, to allow the body, the mind, just everything to come back down to its natural state. And this is sometimes overlooked, but I would say very, very important. And maybe just an example to give is when it is overlooked. So for example, resting after a psychedelic experience, if people go directly into action, and I've seen cases where people, for example, maybe haven't been sleeping afterwards, it's led them to get into an even more disconnected state of mind. So the rest part is really important. And I think this is true also of retreats or other spaces where we've been very open as well. Because that opening, of course, means that if we go into the world and we take even more input, it can sometimes feel very overwhelming. Finding a way to rest, to recover, capturing the insights. So as I mentioned, with writing or for me speaking or recording. So anything that allows us to really just document everything that we remember in this moment, whilst trusting that, if more comes up later, we can still come back to that and add to it. What I sometimes see in experiences like this that have been really profound, for some people, it's actually a real point of responsibility that they feel. So coming back into the world, they feel guilt and responsibility if they're not able to bring some of those insights back. And that can actually lead to worrying, am I not taking advantage? Am I not kind of doing my best to bring this forward to other people? So this guilt and overwhelm can really be put at rest if we're able to capture everything while it's still there. So we don't at least have this feeling of, what if I lose it? What if I forget it? It's like, it's there. I can come back to it whenever I need.
And that's the same with a loved one, of course. That guilt of, what if I forget the person, or what if I don't include them enough in my daily life anymore? Yeah,
Exactly.
beautiful.
Yeah, really beautiful. And also then, once we've captured whatever felt important and whatever we remember right now, we can begin the process of trying to clarify what that is for us, what meaning it has. And especially with some of these peak experiences we're talking about, they can be very metaphorical in their ways of teaching or ways of showing up. So it might be that there is some investigation needed to understand, what does it mean that, I don't know, I saw a lion in this moment, and what does that lion relate to? And it might not be so obvious. Other times we have a very, very clear kind of, this is what you need to do, this is what it means, but not always. So this clarifying, beginning to investigate, beginning to explore, and I'd say always with curiosity is my advice here for people. Just that open, loving curiosity, almost like a child, like, what does it tell me that this showed up? Why did it show up here? This was my intention. How does that connect? So just this open exploration, and slowly from this beginning to find the meaning that we want to ascribe to what we've experienced. And then from that meaning, how do we want to transform it from an insight into something that begins to influence the reality that we live in, begins to have a very real impact on the relationships we have. So for example, it may be an action point to explore a specific aspect or dynamic that exists in a partnership. And so then thinking and taking time again to understand, what is a concrete action that feels tangible, that feels real, that I can start with. Doesn't have to be the big one. It can be also something small that will help me to start making real shifts and changes in my day-to-day life.
So it's the step 1 was the rest, step 2, documentation, step 3, exploration.
Yeah,
clarification. Clarification. I also heard you speak about this overcoming of guilt or shame. And then the message and the meaning and the action. Beautiful. Yeah.
And then not
so valuable.
necessarily as linear, of course, as I described it. Sometimes we do a little back and forth, but
yeah.
The aim is really, for me at least, not to leave that insight there and for it to just be a story, to really try to come through, to the action points so that we can really begin to see shifts in our life.
Yeah, beautiful. So that's actually all about the process after the peak experience. And I wonder, like, what is your role as an integration guide before the whole peak experience is actually started? Is there a role there?
Of course, some experiences we plan. So we know in advance, hey, I'm going to go to this retreat, or I'm going to do this pilgrimage for 5 weeks. So we can really take time to prepare. And even coming back to the death of a loved one, sometimes we have that opportunity to plan, right? So we know someone will pass. We have the possibility to also decide how we want to spend that time beforehand. When working with people preparing for an experience, let's say a retreat or a psychedelic journey, we often start with talking about, the intention going into this. So what is it really that is taking them to that space? And this is really important to plan beforehand, or to at least have clear for ourselves, because even if something else comes up in the experience itself, it can help to really navigate what is happening. And especially if it's overwhelming or particularly challenging, it can also be a point of, let's just say, courage, because we know why we're there. It's like, but I asked for this, I asked to understand, and so I'm ready. And it helps to.
So it's like connecting to your why beforehand.
Exactly, really connecting to that why and having it there present with you in the moment. And in some experiences, if they feel also like they're becoming overwhelming and we're not really sure what's going on in the moment of confusion, it can also give a direction. So it can be a North Star in that sense. So there's some experiences, where you have the opportunity in a way to ask a question in the moment. So to guide the inquiry during the experience itself in the direction of the intention, for example. So it's a really powerful tool. Another way we work on preparation is also preparing how or where you want to come back after such an experience. So very literally, like, what is the physical environment you want to come back into? What would be most serving? Who are the people that will be around you? Do they know what you're going to be doing? Are they open to that? If they're not, what are ways that you can, potentially share with the people that are important, even if they might not be open to the experience itself? We often talk about, sharing the insights as opposed to what exactly happened, because those tend to be very human and very relatable. So people can understand, if you come out of a darkness retreat, even if they've never been to one, and you say, hey, I learned I need to be softer on myself. That's very tangible, even if you've
Yes.
never been into that kind of space or state.
So in that
Yeah.
way, you help also people that don't have like the community around them to listen or understand these types of experiences to still have a possibility to share themselves.
Exactly. Or to identify, if possible, a community that you could connect to. So there may be somebody in your area running some sort of community sharing or events that focus on the type of retreat or experience that you've had, where you'll land and you'll be understood by people who know that space, even if they're not
Yeah.
strangers. So we talk about, what is a support network or system that we can already have in place. And it's great to have it up front, because then when you come back in this very open state, potentially very vulnerable state, it's ready for you to kind of come back into.
How come you started to love this whole topic of integration so much? Because
That's
you
a
really
great.
love it. I see how much you enjoy sharing about it and how much you know about it, how precise you are in it. How did that start?
Yeah, I think you're very right. I do love it. And actually, it started with my own personal experience. So I had some really beautiful psychedelic experiences early on in my, let's say, first phases of really exploring myself and realizing that I want to get to know myself. And when I look back on those experiences, although they really opened me up to something else is possible, and so in that sense they were very important, I realized that I didn't or wasn't able to keep much of what happened there. And so over time, being in the space, I began hearing about integration, and it was often a passing word. It was almost like, okay, make sure you integrate. What does that mean? Just be still, meditate, go into nature. That was kind of the advice that I was hearing in retreats or after psychedelic ceremonies. And what I realized at some point is that there's much more to it. So I started to investigate, look into how the research perspective on integration looks like, why it's important. And it just really drew my attention. And from there, I decided to do a few integration journeys specific to experiences that I'd had. And I realized just how much more I was able to really influence my life and change my life from those experiences, because I took the time and I really explored them. And to this day, like, those ceremonies where I've really spent the time integrating are the ones that are most vivid and alive and clear for me. I know what I need to do or need to apply from the ceremonies. And yeah, it gave me this real understanding and, let's say, realization that this is something that's not only hugely important, but I also felt really excited to share with others. I saw the overlap, first of all, with the coaching that I was already doing at the time, and how many of the tools that I was learning and applying from there can be really beautifully applied to integration, just with a slightly different focus, kind of understanding. And so I decided to, really dive in, learn as much as I could about the topic, and still enjoying
And
it.
here you are. Beautiful. Now, I know there's listeners that really love the space of transformation, of growth. They love to study, they love to learn, they love to go deep. So, how would they know where the balance is between integrating the peak experience that they already went through and also going with the desire of wanting new experiences, peak experience and transformations?
My personal approach to this, I found over time, has been to, when I have an urge to go into another peak experience, to really take some time to investigate in myself what the underlying desire is. And maybe to give you one very concrete example, there was a shaman that I really loved sitting with, and I saw that she was back in Europe, and there was a ceremony that was due to happen. And I had already plans to visit my partner that same weekend. And I thought, okay, I really want to sit with her. I've been waiting for this. I should go into the ceremony. And then I did this practice of just taking a moment to be like, okay, but what is really the underlying motivation? And this thought came to me, and very, very clearly when I just went into the stillness of, okay, so you're going to go to ceremony. And, very often my intention is around understanding love. And, you're going to learn that you should spend more time with the people you love. And you would have actually basically skipped the opportunity to do exactly that in order to sit in ceremony. Have to laugh or like, and this for me then feels very clear of like, okay, actually to integrate the lessons from these ceremonies would be to go and spend time with this person that I love and to keep building that relationship. I also realized in that same investigation that it was more just curiosity and a sense of not wanting to miss out because this person doesn't live in Europe, and so maybe it will be another year. And it wasn't a strong enough real reason connected to myself, to my exploration, to my past that was driving this push, this pull.
Yeah.
So for me, it's really about investigating this, trying to figure out what is the underlying reason. And I have a few rules. So if I'm trying to escape from something, if it's something that I'm looking towards the speak experience to give me a concrete answer, for example, and in a way bypassing my own responsibility in finding that answer, then those are kind of red flags for me personally. And I kind of want to investigate, is there another way to work with this? And it might be that I still come back to that peak experience or that choice of working with something that opens me up in that way. But I would at least then take the time beforehand to recommit myself to preparing for what it is that I'm going into and exploring the topic or the question that I have beforehand with other tools and other modalities. Because for me, this also shows my commitment, right? So if things get difficult, I'll know, no, I'm committed because I've really worked on it before.
Can you repeat those red flags for me? Because I think they're very, very potent.
Escaping from something, if it's a way of escaping my reality or a situation.
Can you give an example of that?
An example would be if let's say I'm already aware of what it is that I need to work on. So I've identified, that I need to address my relationship with my father. But it's difficult for me to do that. I feel really challenged in kind of daily life. And although I have very clear steps forward, I'm not taking action on those. And so I'm kind of trying to almost escape into the experience, hoping for something else, give me a different answer or maybe another time. I want to experience bliss, I kind of as a way of not facing the thing that I actually feel I need to do.
Yeah.
So that's one way.
Like avoiding a discomfort by going into another big experience.
Yeah. And hoping for a blissful experience, for example, or just, kind of wanting to escape from maybe a difficult reality that I'm currently in into, just something joyful.
Yeah.
And that for me is usually a moment of reflecting on what am I actually running from? And it's a good sign to focus in on that topic and on that discomfort. So second red flag for me is if, for example, I notice I'm seeking a quick answer, like a magic pill. I'm not ready to commit to doing the work, so I'm gonna, ask for basically the answer externally. So if I'm giving away my authority, my autonomy, my own innate wisdom in a way by looking for it externally. And one reason it's a red flag for me is because often these big experiences, they don't work that way. So it's also a disappointing experience. It can lead to a lot of frustration. I've seen also people then in that vulnerable space feeling a lot of resentment because they were expecting something and it's not materializing the way they would like. It requires your inner commitment and your inner work to actually make it materialize. And so I also look for this in myself. Am I looking for a quick fix? Am I escaping my own responsibility in that sense? But when it's coming from a place of curiosity, of genuine exploration, of genuine kind of desire to open up and find new perspectives, because that will help me move forward in something I'm investigating or looking into, then I know, okay, there's a space for this that's coming from a healthy direction.
Beautiful. I think it's super valuable, all the things you shared. I think it's something that needs to be spread out. It's important, because I see it. I see it so often, this part gets skipped. And so thank you so much for doing this really beautiful work, very important work.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I completely agree. For me, it's really where a lot of the work gets done. So how do we, really move beyond just the experience, which can, in some ways, it can be quite addictive, right? To be in that peak state. It's something
Yes.
exciting. It's something different. Even if it's challenging, sometimes we feel like we're working.
Yeah.
But then how do we take that same capacity for change and transformation into our lives? And I
Yeah.
really believe it will help us to improve not just our relationships to the people we love, to ourselves, but also really to the planet and to the world that we're all co-creating together.
How do you see that? What would the world look like if we all would spend more time with integration?
I think personally, the more connected I feel to myself, the more able I am to understand what's happening internally, where I can take responsibility, the better my relationships are to the people closest to me. So I'm seeing for sure that my partnership is improving, my relationship to my family is improving. And that's without maybe how I would have approached it before, an expectation that they change or that they do something different. It's finding more empathy, more acceptance, more ability to see the commonality also between us. And that's slowly expanding also then to my community, to people around. I notice myself just being in nature much more in awe of the power of everything that is around, like much more acceptance also for
Mm.
the different, peaks and valleys that life brings us, and a sense of peace. And from that state, I really find it difficult to imagine hurting somebody or wishing somebody to be somehow in any other state. And
Mm.
so it's much easier to be charitable. It's much easier to be loving. It's much easier to accept my fears also in moments that come. And rather than letting them create distance between me and others, to accept them for what they are and keep that connection and closeness. And so my hope is that when we do this inner work and we do the work of integrating it into our relationships, into our life, we're also able to stay connected even in difficult moments, which will come. And we're
Beautiful.
able to act from really a place of much more like alignment with our values, with our, I think, really innate ability to love and to connect with one another.
And if the listener wants to know more about you and your work, we will also link the links below for the ones who want to find out more about where can they find you, or do you have any upcoming offerings or things happening?
Yeah, so I think we have an upcoming retreat in the Netherlands or two this year where we are working with psilocybin truffles. It's a beautiful ceremonial retreat, and what makes it different and why we started this project actually is that we put a lot of emphasis on the preparation and the integration. So we have
Mm.
around 5 weeks together before and after the retreat in total, where we create a container
Wow.
that really helps you to explore this intention and what it is that is bringing you there in the first instance, and then figuring out how to work with it afterwards. That's kind of two very concrete dates that are coming up this year in the Netherlands in end of August and also in October. Yeah, nothing specific. I'm based in Berlin, so there's always something happening here, lots of exploring, but usually sharing these things on my website, on Instagram, etc.
Yeah. And you offer sessions as a life coach?
Yeah, so I also offer coaching trajectories, so focusing on integration, but not exclusively. So sometimes also working with people just in moments of transition. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation. I feel I also learned and was reminded of some very important things. Yeah, for everyone here who wants to find out more about Victoria, check out the links below this episode.
Yes, thank you so much. It was, lovely to connect, to get to know you also in this way and to have the possibility to share. So it really
Yeah.
touched me when you said it's something I love because I feel it.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, for the listeners, I look forward to see you again next week on the podcast. Much love from us. Did you receive any inspiration, motivation, or powerful breakthroughs by listening to this episode? Then please share this episode by taking a screenshot and tagging me in your stories at nicole.nyima.costerus. I would love to celebrate you, share you in my stories, and it would mean so much to have my work reach more powerful, passionate women like you. Thank you so much, and looking forward to see you next week.